Hey there! Welcome back to our series on the early modern land empires. This is part 2 of 2, and we're going to talk about how Asian empires in the period between 1450 and 1750 legitimate their authority. The first question that you are quite likely asking, unless you are a veteran of the AP comparative government videos on this channel, is what on earth is legitimation? And so I will drag a little piece of CompGov vocabulary into this AP World video. Legitimacy refers to people's belief that their government has the right to exercise power in the way that it does. It refers to people's acceptance that their government deserves to have its authority, that their government is the right one to be in power. In other words, if a government has legitimacy, if a state has legitimacy, it can get its people, at least most of the time, to do what it wants them to do, to not rebel, to accept government decisions without constantly hitting them over the head with a stick or threatening them with police or throwing them in jail, right? So legitimacy is the idea that the government gets to exercise power in the way that it does. Rulers have a bunch of different ways of trying to legitimate their authority. You might be able to think of some examples from the modern period, which tend to refer in democratic societies, especially more to people agreeing with the process by which people come to power. But in the early modern period, these ideas are going to center more on the persona of the ruler and on the identity of the state, of the country. So I'll run through just a few possible examples. One is, of course, personal charisma. The ruler might say, I get to be in power because I am the strongest person or the best looking person or the most brilliant person in the land, and therefore I am best suited to occupy this role of power. So you'll see rulers do lots of things to try and make themselves, as individual humans, look better, look more impressive, look more forbidding, look more like somebody who their people will think deserves to be in leadership. A second option is to attach yourself to tradition, to say that I am ruling in a way that is carrying on the venerable tradition of the people who came before me, of the rulers who came before me, of this country which has existed, of the state which has existed for however many generations. And only by putting your trust in me to rule you, only by deferring to my power, can you ensure the continuation of this tradition. A third possibility is the idea of divine right, which we start seeing articulated by various rulers, probably for self-serving purposes, in the early modern period. And that is some variation on the theme of God put me on the throne. We've seen that, of course, going very, very, very far back in history, way before this course picks up in the year 1200. But in the early modern period, you'll start to see more explicit articulations in writing and in speech by various monarchs, by emperors, by shahs, by sultans, saying either some combination of God put me on the throne, and because God put me on the throne, or perhaps because I am even the emanation of God on earth, I get to do whatever I want and you had better listen to me. So that's the idea of divine right in less fancy terms. Another possibility, overlapping a little bit with that idea of tradition, is this idea that there is a national identity common to all subjects of a given ruler, and that only by ensuring that that ruler is able to exercise power can we ensure the continuation of the venerable, the glorious, the wonderful, the admirable tradition of those people who are ruled. And so this is where you start to see appeals to some idea of an Ottoman national identity or a common Iranian culture or a common Mughal culture, etc., etc. So sometimes in that vein, you'll actually see rulers patronizing art, patronizing literature, patronizing philosophy, supporting these artistic and cultural expressions of this national identity, which serves in part to build up their own political legitimacy as well. There's a whole bunch of other ways of asserting legitimacy. You'll see rulers in this period using different ones that I haven't listed here, and you'll see them using multiple different options. These are not necessarily mutually exclusive with one another, but those are just a few ideas to get you thinking about this concept of ways in which rulers might seek to legitimate their authority. Today, I'm going to highlight two categories of examples. I'm going to talk about religious ideas, and then I'm going to talk about art and architecture. So first, a few examples of rulers using religious ideas, religious beliefs to justify their claims of authority, to justify their claims to the throne, to justify their claims of state power. And you've seen these again, but it's worth noting, it's worth being able to describe these in slightly more precise terms than just the ruler claims to be blessed by God. So one that we've talked about, I think, extensively this week is the Safavid Persian conversion to Shia Islam, which marks them out as being different from the Ottoman Empire, which is their major political competitor for power, and which marks them out as being different from much of the rest of the Muslim world. And so when the Safavid rulers adopt Shiism as their official religion, what they're doing is claiming for themselves the idea that they're the protectors of the true faith and that their authority is necessary to ensure that the true faith will gain more hold on earth. A second idea is that the European monarchs in particular start to articulate this idea of divine right. In the early modern period. You can see here one particularly direct statement by King James VI of Scotland, who becomes King James I of England in 1609 or maybe 1610, who says that kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth, and sit upon God's throne, but even by God himself they are called gods. Kings are justly called gods, for that they exercise a manner or resemblance of divine power upon earth. So you can see how, if you believe that as your theology, you can certainly be persuaded to accept the idea that your ruler gets to do whatever they want to do, regardless of who else agreed to it. If we go over to China, we see a very different form of invoking religious authority because the prevailing belief system is so different from the Christianity that undergirded King James's version of his own authority. The Confucian emphasis on ritual, on hierarchy, prescribes that the emperor should perform a number of rituals in public every year as kind of a way of ensuring the continued functioning of the state, of ensuring that the mandate of heaven will continue to be conferred on their throne. So this image you're looking at, for instance, depicts one of the most important ritual responsibilities of the emperor of China through the Qing dynasty, which is to offer sacrifices to an altar to the god of agriculture. In order to ensure that the harvest will continue to be successful and that farmers will continue to be able to feed the country. And so the emperor's performance of these ritual obligations is seen as a way of kind of holding the country together, and the power accorded to the emperor, the status and significance accorded to the emperor, are seen as making it particularly important that the emperor, as opposed to some other random bureaucrat, performs these ceremonies. So by fulfilling their role, by fulfilling the obligations imposed by the predominant belief system, the emperor can shore up their own claim to be legitimately exercising authority. A final example, if we want to get really extreme in making that connection between the ruler doing something, performing some religious obligation, and the continued survival of the society, is the concept of human sacrifice in Aztec beliefs. We talked about this a little bit in Unit 1, but the Aztec emperors support this complex of beliefs, which basically says that if the priestly class doesn't perform these rituals of human sacrifice, the earth will literally cease to exist. So that's a pretty extreme version of this idea that the ruler and the people employed by the ruler are absolutely essential to avoiding the wrath of God being brought down on the people. The other category of things that I'll talk about briefly today is the use of art and architecture. And this is a little bit less intuitive. It's not my personal strong suit in teaching this class. And it's also not something that we always immediately connect to political legitimacy. But that connection between cultural beliefs, cultural expressions, and the upholding of a particular political order is really important in considering how these early modern land empires hold themselves together. So one really common approach is for the court, the ruler's household, to sponsor art, to sponsor painters, to sponsor sculptors, to sponsor architects, to sponsor musicians, writers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the content of that art will often do something to promote the image of the emperor as legitimate, or to promote the idea of a national identity, which is upheld and which is held together and given coherence and meaning by the state, by the ruler, or by the institutions of the state. So, for instance, during the Qing dynasty, emperors commission a series of portraits. It's kind of standard practice for rulers to hire artists to do these portraits of emperors and other members of the royal family, performing a variety of duties that in some way or another will make them look good. So the portrait you're looking at now is a portrait of the Kangxi Emperor, whose reign starts in the mid 17th century and then lasts until 1722. And you'll notice that he's pictured in this kind of repose with a book on his lap, which kind of suggests that he is upholding this traditional Confucian value of scholarship, of learning, of reverence for knowledge. But you'll also see portraits of the Qing emperors displaying them upholding other values as well, maybe martial values, maybe sort of agricultural activities. And so you'll see a variety of different depictions targeted at a variety of different audiences. Sometimes the art isn't always quite as explicit as that. The art might simply create, court-sponsored art might create kind of a unified style that's associated with the Ottoman elite or with the Mughal elite, but that nonetheless kind of holds particularly the elite community together by conveying to them this idea that the ruler and their household and their family and the complex of activities built up around them are all sufficiently sophisticated and refined and cultured people to merit their position at the top of high society. Second, we'll see a proliferation of religious buildings around the early modern world in this period. Lots and lots of rulers will sponsor the construction of mosques, of cathedrals, et cetera, et cetera. In order to demonstrate very obviously their dedication to upholding whatever religion is allegedly giving them legitimacy to exercise political power. So the really, really inescapable example in this period is, as you're looking at, the Taj Mahal, which is built by Shah Jahan in the Mughal Empire in the mid-17th century as a mausoleum for his favorite wife, who dies shortly after giving birth to their 14th child. You will note that this building includes, it's built as a mausoleum and not as a mosque, but it includes these features of architecture that we tend to associate with the Islamic world, like these arches all around the building, like these domes up top, and the four minarets that are positioned around the building. And so this isn't just a I miss my wife, this kind of building. This is also a demonstration of the ruler's both fidelity to Islam and more generally his ability to have a almost perfectly symmetrical, massive building constructed out of pure white marble. And a lot of these buildings, a lot of the architectural decisions in particular, are just about showing off the sheer power and wealth of the ruler, even beyond any particular values that might be embodied in the buildings or in the art. In that same vein, rulers will also construct just massive, truly impressive palaces, which are very purposefully designed to impress the people and in some ways to facilitate other more directly political behaviors that serve the ruler's interest. So the sort of obvious example here, the paradigmatic example here is Versailles, constructed in France under the reign of Louis XIV. This is a palace that has over 2,000 rooms. It has fountains. It has extensive and beautiful landscaped gardens. It has a private zoo in it. And so, at the most basic level, it's just this gigantic, beautiful, incredibly expensive construction that shows off to Louis's subjects and to his nobles his power and his refinement. But he also builds all these apartments at Versailles and requires his nobles to live in them, to attend him at the court. And this serves the secondary function of preventing these nobles from going home to the provinces and fomenting some sort of intrigue against the king. You might make some comparisons to what the Tokugawa shoguns do by requiring their daimyo to live in the capital every other year. Another example of monumental palaces as a symbol of royal authority is the Forbidden City, which is constructed in Beijing first during the Ming Dynasty. And the design of that building is planned out to do a couple of specific things. One is to reflect this kind of sense of hierarchy. So there are spaces that are open to people for official business. There are spaces that are open to men only to conduct the business of government, when there are other spaces further on the inside of the complex that are restricted to the emperor, to members of the royal family, and to the people who serve them directly in a personal capacity. So it conveys a sense of hierarchy just by making it very obvious which spaces are for whom. it's designed in this way that's supposed to reflect Confucian ideology. There's all these kind of principles about the ordering of the universe that are reflected in the physical layout of the Forbidden City. And of course, this idea of just having this massive palace complex, entry to which is kind of restricted, serves to heighten the sense of mystique that surrounds the emperor and the royal family. Um, Finally, you'll see some early modern rules specifically just build capitals or change their capitals and engage in this really extensive sort of city planning to try and emphasize their vision of what their government is all about. So, for instance, you're looking here at an aerial view of the main square called the Maidan in Isfahan, which is established as the capital of the Safavid Empire by Shah Abbas in the late 16th century. Today, it's Iran's, I think, third largest city and the headquarters of its nuclear research program. But when Shah Abbas turns this into its capital, he orders the construction of this massive square, which is surrounded by shops and apartments. It's space for public assemblies. It's space for people to play polo. But he also encourages the construction of both religious and commercial buildings. And so this is a city whose physical layout, whose infrastructure reflects this kind of dual identity of the Safavid Empire as both a place that values commerce, that creates all these bazaars and marketplaces where merchants can conduct trade, but that also constructs a bunch of religious buildings and actually hires scholars to come from elsewhere in the Muslim world to move to the Safavid Empire and to be part of its religious establishment. So here we see both architecture and religion lending legitimacy, lending political authority to the ruler at the same time. That's a lot of examples for you. We'll consider some more in class the next time I see you, but I want to leave with this last idea. I think it's pretty common for my students to look at monarchs, to look at dictators, to look at emperors, to look at sultans and say, well, these people must be able to just do absolutely whatever they want. And if you don't do absolutely whatever they want, then off with your head. And that's an oversimplification of the way that power works, even in these absolutist societies where, in principle, the emperor is God. Even monarchs can't rule strictly by power. They can't rule strictly by coercive force. They can't rule strictly by threatening to hit you with a stick. And if you've taken CompGov, this is a theme we've talked about constantly to the point that you're probably sick of it. So as we look at these early modern empires, the one thing I want you to consider is the ways in which rulers, not just the monarch themselves, but also other people attached to the state, to the institutions of the government, look at the ways in which those people try to project power and try to build legitimacy and try to convince people that they should go along with what the state wants them to do, even without the obvious threat of coercive force being applied. That's it. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and I'll see you.